Okay, in this lecture we're going to talk about Chapter 10 of American Pageant, launching the new ship of state, 1789 to 1800, just the development of our new nation. Real quickly, let's review. America has just constructed a new form of government under the Constitution. Remember, we have completely done away with the Articles of Confederation for this new, stronger central government. So there are three big questions, okay? Who's going to be the president? What's that going to look like? What's the office going to look like? How do we set up the judiciary branch? And we still have to settle the implementation of the Bill of Rights, which was promised to ratify the Constitution. So we have to be extremely cautious about foreign relations because we know war is really costly, war is expensive, and we are still really weak as a nation. We don't have a big army. We don't have a good economic situation. So we have to be careful of these vulnerable situations like war and stay out of that. So the first order of business for our new Congress is to elect a president. So they convene in New York, which is the capital at the time, and they elect George Washington as the first president of the United States in 1789. He is the only president that has been unanimously elected. Some of the reasons, kind of like the reasons why selecting him as the general of the army was important. One, he's trustworthy. People in the United States trust him, and he has good faith. He's a war hero, which always is good for presidents. He's aligned the North and the South together. People in the South love him because he's from the South. People in the North love him because he won the war, which was primarily fought in the North. He is not like any other politician. He didn't really want to be the president. Often he didn't have things to do because being the president then is much different than it is today. Okay, today the president is minute by minute, second by second scheduled out. When George Washington was the president, there wasn't as much for him to do, especially foreign relations wise. So there was often times where he would actually put ads in the newspaper advertising, "Hey, come over for tea. I'm free this afternoon." Some of the things that's important is he's going to actually set the precedent for every president after him. So the first president's extremely important. One of the big things he does is he establishes the cabinet, which is not in the Constitution. This is just something he takes upon himself to do. So the three members of his cabinet are John Adams, who is his vice president, Alexander Hamilton, who's the Secretary of Treasury, Thomas Jefferson, who is the Secretary of State, and Henry Knox, who is the Secretary of War. We're going to see some major conflict between Jefferson and Hamilton here in the next couple slides. So aside from deciding who the president's going to be, the second order of business is to pass the Bill of Rights to amend the Constitution. Remember, Anti-Federalists were promised this would be the first action of the new Congress by the Federalists before they would ratify the Constitution. So without this promise, the Constitution probably wouldn't have been passed. James Madison drafts this. He's a hardcore Federalist. He wants to not undo their prior victory with getting the Constitution ratified. So he is the author of these amendments. He actually proposes 12, only 10 get passed. So we know the purpose of the Bill of Rights is to protect those individual liberties which we had just fought the Revolutionary War for. Liberties like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, liberties like that we hold dear. The Anti-Federalists wanted them down in writing because they felt if they weren't in writing, the government, a tyrannical, strong central government, could strip the people of those liberties. So after the Bill of Rights, the Congress has to set up the judicial system, or the judicial branch of the federal government. They do this with the Judiciary Act of 1789, and what it does is it organizes the Supreme Court, which is the supreme law of the land. It sets it up with 6 justices, one of them being the Chief Justice, who is John Jay. And they also set up some federal district courts. They set up 13, one for each state. And what it really does is it also authorizes the Supreme Court, or these federal courts, to review all state court decisions. This makes them the highest authority in the land. So after the judicial branch is set up, we move on to a bigger issue, which is the economic problems the nation is facing. And enter Alexander Hamilton, who is the Secretary of Treasury. He is a key member to this new young government. He is the father of national debt, and if you've seen the commercials, the father of modern banking. The goal here is to correct economic problems that had crippled the Articles of Confederation. Remember that interstate commerce and different things like that. How he does this, first of all, he writes the report on public credit in 1790, in which he used this report to suggest the United States pay off its domestic and foreign debts, which at that time had risen somewhere between 50 and 70 million, depending on the numbers you get in the textbooks. Um, by doing this, by paying it off, he thought that he could improve the credit rating of the nation, and in addition, loans could be obtained from other countries, and the economy could then be expanded by offering credit or loans to start up new businesses and expand in other directions. So how's he going to do this? Well, his plan is to shape government financial policy to favor the wealthy. In turn, they would lend the government money and political support, and then prosperity would flow from the top down to the masses. So Hamilton's first objective here is to bolster the national credit. We always want our credit to be good, that way we can get loans. So he needed Congress to take on the entire national debt. And right now we're talking like debt to individuals and debt to individual states. His strategy here is called funding par. This meant that the federal government would pay back its debt at face value plus interest. Well, at the time, debt to individuals, debt to states was around 54 million, plus $13 million in interest, which gets to 67 million, so close to $70 million. The problem is there's a lack of confidence from the people. We see this lack of trust because the government bonds actually that were issued at this point in time were only getting about 10 to 15 cents a dollar. That obviously shows a lack of confidence. The hope that Hamilton has is that by taking and building the national credit, the federal government will build trust in the nation. Congress is going to pass this act in 1790, so his first objective is passed. Hamilton's second objective kind of goes along with the first one because it involves state debt. It is called assumption, which the national debt is going to assume state debt or kind of take it on as their own burden. The argument here is that because debt was incurred fighting for national independence, it should be taken on by national government. This is the argument of the northern states, states with large debt, because that's primarily where the fighting occurred. States in the South don't really want assumption because they don't have large debt. So Virginia doesn't have a large debt. They can pay it off pretty easily. They don't want the national government. They don't want to be tied to them necessarily. So they don't necessarily want assumption to pass. The thought here by the national government is that assumption is going to chain states more closely together. It's also going to give them support and unity. This is going to shift the attachment of wealthy creditors from the states to the national government, which is going to feed into Hamilton's plan. Remember, he wants the wealthy to be owed money by the national government. The problem, again, was different states want it, and states in the South with no debt really don't want it. The solution here is the South wants the national capital. So Virginia is going to get the federal district, or the District of Columbia, on the Potomac River. It's going to bring commerce because it's on the water. It's going to bring fame, prestige, a lot of people, and assumption is going to get passed through Congress. So with his first two objectives complete, now the national government has this huge debt, and the question becomes, how are they going to pay off that debt? How are they going to raise revenue to do that? And the answer is going to be customs duties and excise tax on very few domestic items, specifically whiskey. It's really interesting how we just fought a war revolving around taxes, but now we're more than willing to implement the tax to pay off debt, much like Britain tried to do with us after the French and Indian War. So we need to raise money. And Hamilton sees this national debt as this national blessing, because the more people the government owes money to, the more people want it to succeed. So he's going to bring about this union adhesiveness because they need the government to succeed so they get paid. So he needs to raise money. Number one, customs duties or tariffs. And tariffs depend on a vigorous foreign trade to make money. So this is really critical to Hamilton's plan. We need to trade with other nations. Like, we need to sell our goods to other nations. The problem with that is, remember, we usually get our goods from other nations. So we need to increase our industry, increase our manufacturing. And a good way to do that is to implement a tariff law, which he does. It gets the Congress to pass in 1789. It's an 8% tax on the value of dutiable imports. That's going to bring in revenue, that 8%, but it's also going to protect our industry and let it grow from its infancy, because other countries aren't going to want to trade with us as much if they have to pay this 8% tax, which was high at the time. So a second way to raise revenue is an internal tax, and Congress passes one in 1791. The excise tax on whiskey specifically is going to be 7 cents a gallon tax, and it's going to be paid by the seller. The problem is in western frontier areas, whiskey kind of just flows pretty freely. It's actually used as currency because it's easier to transport whiskey than it is to transport the grain to the markets and sell it that way. So these frontier really moonshiners are going to challenge this law in 1794 with the Whiskey Rebellion. And what George Washington does is he's going to pretty much prove that the central government is willing and able to suppress violent resistance to laws. Okay, remember Shays' rebellion. They didn't do that. The Articles of Confederation didn't allow them to do that. Now the Constitution does, and he's going to prove that it was worth it. So he does that. He sends 13,000 troops to western Pennsylvania to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion. By the time he gets there, it had pretty much scattered and didn't exist anymore. Remember, this is a despised tax, and it really didn't collect a lot of money because people just got around it. So Hamilton has a plan to take on the debt, and then he has a plan to raise money to pay off that debt. Now his fourth objective is a plan to keep that money safe, and it is the Bank of the United States, which is really the capstone and really his baby when it comes to his economic plan. It's going to be a private institution in which the government is a major stockholder and could deposit its surplus funds, which is kind of ironic because we know the government doesn't have surplus funds today. But there are some positives to this. One, it is a strong box for the federal government. It's a safe place to keep their money. Also, number two, federal funds would stimulate business by being in circulation. We know today more money in circulation is better for our economy. And three, it's going to create a sound and stable national currency. Remember, we didn't have one of those under the Articles of Confederation. Each state kind of had their own currency, which led to a lot of inflation and a lot of these interstate squabbles. This Bank of the United States is going to be extremely controversial, though, and we're going to see Thomas Jefferson butt heads with Alexander Hamilton on the issue, is this constitutional to create such a bank? So we're going to have these two guys start to butt heads, and it really becomes on how do they interpret the Constitution. Jefferson is going to be a literal or strict interpretation of the Constitution. He thinks that all powers not specifically granted by the Constitution to the central government were states' rights. The states controlled it. Alexander Hamilton actually believes in a loose or broad interpretation of the Constitution. He believed what the Constitution did not forbid, it permitted. He's actually going to use the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution to give his argument legitimacy. Because Hamilton actually believes that the Bank of the United States is going to aid this capitalist class by extending credit to them. Remember, he wants to promote capitalism and industry and manufacturing, which Southerners, agricultural individuals don't really want, which Thomas Jefferson gets his support from them. So we're going to have this unity issue over the bank. Support for the bank is rooted in the North, which makes sense because manufacturing and industry is found there, centers of commerce and financial institutions. Opposition for the bank is going to be located in the agricultural South, which Thomas Jefferson is getting his support from. But there's a lot of squabbling, and eventually Congress passes the Bank of the United States and creates it in 1791 and gives it a 20-year charter. It's going to be located in Philadelphia. The federal government's going to put $10 million in capital into it, so they own 20% of the bank. They control 20%. Domestic individuals control 60%, and private foreign individuals are going to control the other 20%. So everyone has a part in the bank. The reason individuals, domestically and foreign, private individuals are going to be involved is to provide support and good faith for the bank. And the federal government is going to provide trust because they're putting $10 million in capital.